In this video, we'll be exploring the options available to us when styling text with CSS. In order to do this, we'll be styling two HTML pages. The first presents a user with a poem, and the second, in a very similar manner, presents a short story. We'll be writing all of our CSS in an external file so that we don't have to write twice the rules that we're going to use for both the poem and short story pages. Let's begin by taking a look at the poetry page in a web browser. It's a very simple page. It has a header element, some paragraph elements, and also a link to our story page, which is set up in the same manner. The glaring issue is that all of our poem's text has been compressed into this great big block, which is not human readable, especially for a poem. If we go back to our HTML page, we'll see that the poem is presented in a much more human readable manner. And it's kind of odd that we would lose this readability when we went from HTML to browser display. The issue is a CSS styling property called whitespace. An element's whitespace property is responsible for two related things. First, it describes how the text will handle the presence of space, tabs, and new lines, what we call whitespace. And secondly, it describes how the text will react if the space given to it, generally the size of the containing element, becomes too small for it to render full lines naturally. To begin playing with the whitespace attribute, let's create a class for our poem paragraph. If we wanted to, we could explicitly write the default whitespace rule which our paragraph is observing like this. Whitespace normal. The normal whitespace rule, like all whitespace rule, declares two things. First, it declares that all whitespace collapses into a single space. And secondly, it declares that text will wrap. Let's start with the collapsing bit of the rule. That's what's bothering us with the display of this poem. All whitespace collapses into a single space means that we'll never see new lines. We will only ever see lengths of the whitespace the length of a standard spacebar space. We need new lines to make our poem display like a poem should. Wrapping means that the text will add new lines when it comes to the end of its containing element. We can see this by shrinking the size of our window, thus compressing the width of the paragraph element which contains the text. The text adds new lines at the end of words so that it still displays properly in the width that we've given it. In addition to the inherit option, which just says use the whitespace attribute of my closest relevant ancestor, we have 5 options. Instead of normal, we could choose no wrap. No wrap works just like normal, but no wrapping occurs. That means that when we resized our browser window, rather than adding new lines to attempt to make the text fit, our browser would simply display whatever bit of the text fit in our new frame of view. This is not what we want because we're very interested in getting rid of the collapsing whitespace property, which no wrap preserves. To get rid of collapsing whitespace, we could choose the pre or preserve option. This means that whitespace is preserved as it is in the raw text. Pre all by itself also means that no wrapping will occur. If we'd like to both preserve whitespace and have some wrapping, we could choose either pre-line or pre-wrap. Pre-wrap means that whitespace is both preserved and normal wrapping occurs, whereas pre-line is kind of a middle child. It actually says that whitespace collapses, but whitespace will not collapse across new lines. Also, normal wrapping occurs. For our purposes, both pre-line, and pre-wrap will look pretty good. They'll get rid of that blocky text view that we didn't like. I'm going to choose the pre option because I do not want the browser to ever decide to break the lines of a poem. While we're at it, we can make our poem look a little more poem-like by adding text align styling. By default, text is aligned to the left, or the left option. In this text editor, the text is aligned to the left. Text can also be aligned to the right, which is just the flip of this. The text will be flush to the right side of the screen, or in this case, the element containing it. We're going to use the text align center property, which means the center of every line of text will be in the center of the element containing it. So let's save that, go back and save our poem page, and take a look at that in our browser. I think that looks much better. It looks like a poem. Let's leave off the heavy lifting for a minute and do some aesthetic level styling. I'd like to underline all of these H1 elements to separate them from the rest of the page. I'm not going to need a class designation for this because this is a change I'd like to make across all H1 elements. But I'd also like to do some custom styling for all story and poem titles. And for that I will need a class because I need to differentiate them from other paragraph elements. So we'll make that the title class. And then I'd like to do some styling for authors. I'm of course going to need to make these class designations on the story page as well. So like I said, we can access the H1 elements through a general rule. And what we want to do here is underline these elements. As far as CSS is concerned, underline is a text decoration. And it's called underline. My other text decoration options are overline, which is a line that appears over the text, and line through, which is a line that appears through the text. It's actually line dash through. Now, let's make all of our titles bold-faced text. And we do that with the font weight option. And we can simply choose bold. Similarly, we can make author elements italic text by changing the font style option to italic. So let's save everything and take a look at our page in browser and make sure that these changes occurred, which they did. There's our underlined, bold, and italic text. If we go to the story page, we do see underline, bold, and italic text. At some point, we should probably modify the white space removal on the story block like we did with the poem. But for now, I'd like to modify the hyperlink. Because hyperlinks have a couple of states, like mouse over and clicked, we can do some interesting things with them. Here's our page's link element. It's actually an anchor element with a special attribute that makes it a link. We could then style this element by writing a general rule for anchor elements, but that's broader than what we want to do. We'd only like to select anchor elements which happen to be links. And we can use the link pseudo-selector to do that. What the link pseudo-selector does is selects all of an element type, in this case anchor elements, which happen to be links, and that's exactly what we want. My plan is to make the links on our page invisible to casual viewers. I'm going to do this by turning all of the links white, where they'll blend in with the white background of the page. Unfortunately, this rule alone won't achieve that in all cases. That's because there's two types of links. Unvisited links, which we've styled here, and visited links, which get their own styling rule. On a web page, you generally see visited links as purple and underlined, and unvisited links presented blue and underlined. To style our visited links also, we use the visited property. I've tabbed in this second rule because it's conceptually linked with the first. The tab has no effect on the execution of my code, but makes it easier for me and other developers to see that this is a block of related rules. If we go to our web page now, we'll see that the link element has disappeared. I can, however, mouse over the element and click on it. It still exists. It's just white, and I can't visually discern it from the background. I think it would be fair for our links to visually identify themselves when a user mouses over them. We can do this with the hover pseudo-selector, which of course applies when a user has moused over the link. Let's use the general blue color for links that the user has moused over. You should only ever declare a hover pseudo-selector after you have already declared the link and visited pseudo-selector for that type of object. The last pseudo selector I'd like to use here is the active pseudo selector, which applies when a user has actually clicked on the link. It's a really good idea to declare this selector because it provides immediate visual feedback to the user that their action has been received. Like the hover pseudo selector, you should only ever declare an active pseudo selector when the link, visited, and hover pseudo selectors for that element type have already been declared. Let's take a look at our page and make sure that our link worked as expected. It's still invisible. When we mouse over it, it turns blue, and when we click it, it turns green. I think it's about time we style our story element. So let's create a class for that. As with our poem, we want to modify the way that whitespace is handled. If you remember, with the poem, we chose the pre or preserve whitespace option because we wanted whitespace to be preserved, but we did not want wrapping to occur. For our story, I'm going to choose pre-wrap because I do want wrapping to occur. I'm not going to pick pre-line because that would get rid of any tabs that the author has added to their story. The other thing I'd like to do here is change the font that our story is presented in. In CSS2, we do this with the font family property. Ideally, I'd like my story to present in Arial font. The important thing to understand about fonts when it comes to CSS2 is that a browser can only display fonts that are loaded on the machine it's running on. That means that even though Arial is a web-safe font and it should be loaded on any machine viewing web pages, I can't be guaranteed it is. So I can specify backup fonts by separating the fonts with commas. In this case, I'm going to specify sans serif as a backup font. This isn't actually a font, it's a family of fonts. And machines who have fonts installed know this. So, if the machine does not have the Arial font installed, it will pick any font from the sans serif family to substitute. Fonts that come earlier in the comma-separated list will take precedence. I should also note that if the font has spaces in the name, it needs to be included in quotation marks. Before we'll see these changes on our page, we of course need to specify that this paragraph element is of the story class. And here's our modified story page. The font has changed to Arial, and we can quickly check that wrapping is working as intended by resizing the page, and wrapping appears to be working. The last thing I'd like to do is modify the font that our poem appears in, but I don't want to use a web-safe font. I have a very specific font in mind. The technique I'm about to show you is generally considered a new CSS3 technique, but in reality it's been supported to some degree since CSS2. However, it's not until recently, when all major browsers began upgrading for CSS3, that we could make the claim that this technique is supported by all major browsers. Let's take a look at my desktop where I'm serving this web page from. In addition to my HTML and CSS files, I have two font files. One is a .ttf, or true type font, and the other is an embedded open type font. This is the same font in two files, and the reason I need two files is that Internet Explorer and all other web browsers view fonts differently. Internet Explorer, we will serve the .eot file, and we'll serve the .ttf file to all other browsers. You may see fonts in the .otf format as well. For our purposes, we can use that format interchangeably with the .ttf format. If you find that you have a .ttf or a .eot and you'd like to create a copy of that font in a different format, there are many free online converters available. So let's go ahead and instruct any visiting web browsers to dynamically load a new font from those two font files that we just looked at. We do this with CSS's font face rule, which essentially allows us to declare a brand new font type. The font face function takes two parameters. First, we give it a font family, and this is the name of our new font. Let's call it custom. And second, we need to tell it where to find this font. We know that our font files are in the same folder as our CSS, so we don't need to path to them. We can just serve up the URL myfont.ttf. This will work for all major web browsers except for Internet Explorer, because if you remember, Internet Explorer does not use .ttf files for its font, it uses .eot files. Now we supported Internet Explorer. We don't need to specifically target the different web browsers with these rules, because if a rule does not apply to the web browser, it will simply skip over it. Now, all we need to do is use the font family attribute in our poem rule to access the font that we've dynamically loaded. And here's our poem in its creepy but appropriate font. Having come to the end of this video, it's my hope that you've gained an understanding of the concepts of whitespace preservation, wrapping, that you can style links in various states, that you can create bold, italic, and underlined fonts, and that you understand how fonts as a whole are handled by the web browser and the CSS. Until next time.